Welcome to Supply Chain Now, the voice of global supply chain. Supply Chain Now focuses on the best in the business for our worldwide audience, the people, the technologies, the best practices, and today's critical issues, the challenges and opportunities. Stay tuned to hear from those making global business happen right here on Supply Chain Now.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Scott Luton and always special guest Mike Griswold with you here on Supply Chain Now. Welcome to today's show. Mike, how are you doing?
Hey, Scott, I'm doing well, thank you. Great to be back with you again and having a chance to talk about what I think today will be a very interesting show for us.
I completely agree. And you're dialed in, I think I can let this cat out of the bag, from your hometown in Perry, New York, home of not just the Yellow Jackets, which is a high school, but home of the Sea Serpents, which we talked about a year or so ago, right?
Correct. Also, for folks maybe of not your age, Scott, you're too young, my age, Champion Products used to be here, who used to make the NFL jerseys. We used to have a big Champion plant here. And for those of you with a sweet tooth, we were the home of Archway cookies.
Oh,
so,
I love it.
Neither of which are still here, unfortunately. But it was a pretty big accomplishment for a small town that had. I mean, my graduating class was 120. Population is about 4,000 people. So,
wow.
Yeah, so small town.
So now, Mike Tyson was one of the earliest sports figures I can recall wearing Champion everything. It makes a little more sense now because I think Iron Mike is from New York State, if I'm not mistaken.
He is, I believe, from the Catskills area of New York State.
And believe it or not, he's still boxing, folks. I can't wait to that match in November. We'll see. Okay. But folks, backed by popular demand, one of our longest running and most popular series here, Supply Chain Today and Tomorrow with Mike Griswold with Gartner. Mike, of course, serves as Vice President Analyst with the Gartner organization. And as Mike mentioned, we got a great episode, a fun episode here today. We're going to be tying supply chain leadership themes, trends, topics to some of our favorite TV shows of all time. So stay tuned for a wonderful, intriguing conversation with the one and only Mike Griswold. Okay, so Mike, we're going to get a bonus fun warm-up question here today. We touched on Perry. Was cool. That was a blast from our past a year or so ago. But I want to ask you this. We got kids mostly across really the globe, certainly across the states, are finally back in school. We got Major League Baseball pennant races close to wrapping up. We'll see if the Braves can inch their way past the Mets. It's been a tough season for the Braves. Football is back, thankfully. Hopefully summer heat highs are done. We're seeing cooler temps, at least in Metro Atlanta, thankfully. So we're so slowly but surely moving back into fall. So I got to ask, you've had quite the summer. I know we have too. What's one of your favorite highlights from summer 2024?
So probably one of the easiest questions I think you've ever asked me, Scott, in our time together is my wife and I came back a couple of weeks ago from our second trip to Scotland.
Oh,
so
man.
We stayed we rented an apartment in St. Andrews. We played a little bit of golf. And the main reason for the trip was we watched the Women's Open from St. Andrews, won by Lydia Ko. We were treated to the full Scottish weather experience. Rain, consistent winds in the 30 to 40 mile per hour range across most of the days that we were there. So it was the full immersion of what Scotland and Scotland golf is like. So it was a great time, though.
Sounds like it. Speaking of rain and rain gear, I took the kids one football game. I want to say it's Clemson versus Georgia Tech. It could have been Clemson versus Notre Dame, but it was like in the monsoon conditions. And I prided myself on having some rain gear for my golf days when I golf a little more. But I'll tell you, when you sit through a monsoon, about the third hour in, there's very little that is rain-proof. Did you have better rain gear than I had over in Scotland, Mike?
I would say slightly, but similar. Most of the rain gear, unless you're going to like the Arctic, is not designed to be sitting, to your point, for 3 or 4 hours in 35 mile an hour winds, 59 degrees and rain. I mean, it's just, the testers aren't doing that, right? So I don't know there's anything you can really buy for that. I mean, there was at one point, Scott, we were sitting, and I looked at my wife because we could see we were at a good spot to watch the players come into a couple of holes. And we were in a grandstand with a number of people. And I looked at my wife and I said, the players must be looking at us saying, hey, we have to be here because we're players. It's like, what are all of you people doing here? So,
y'all love golf. I tell you, love golf. Well, wonderful. Who knows? Maybe those folks at Champion can work on bulletproof rain gear. We'll see.
Yes.
All right, let's get to work here, Mike. We got a great show here. I want to establish our theme again up front because we tied it into really a seasonal event, and our theme is a universal one, right? We all love our television shows. Some are more addictive than others. Me and Amanda love, we were talking pre-show, The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, Boardwalk Empire, ton of shows that are just addictive. Seinfeld, of course. So we're recording this interview, though, a few days before the 76th Primetime Emmy Awards, which, of course, is an annual fair that recognizes the best in television over the previous year. Now, Mike, did you know the first Emmy Awards ceremony was held on January 25th, 1949 at the Hollywood Athletic Club? Tickets were $5 to get in. That's about $66 somehow in $2024. I need to check that math. But it was an inclusive, everybody's welcome affair. Now it's like highfalutin, red carpet, you name it, you name it. So we're going to walk through at least 3 shows that give us some supply chain lessons to be learned. So, Mike, where are we starting with your first show?
Yeah, we're going to start with MacGyver, and people can either think about the original with Richard Dean Anderson. They can think about the remake with, I don't know who he was, but he kind of looked like a young MacGyver. But to me, that show is about one of the things that most supply chains are wrestling with now. It's one of the hot topics that we have at Gartner, is this idea of resilience and adaptability and the ability to, think fairly quickly on your feet as a supply chain executive. So if you think about, the typical MacGyver episode where he's thrown into a challenge with a bunch of, semi-random objects and is asked to kind of figure his way out of the challenge using basically the few things that are around him. A lot of that applies to how we need to think about our supply chains, right? We have things around us, probably more applicable to the supply chain than MacGyver had laying around in his pocket. But we have to be able to think about and see things a little bit differently if we want to be resilient, right? And if we want to have this ability to adapt. So, thinking about, one of the topics we talk all the time about, this idea of demand planning, right? And we all have kind of the way we've always done demand planning. But now think about things like AI, right? And think about things like, Chat GPT and those types of things. Those are potentially new things that, MacGyver would find laying around and ask himself, right, how can I use this Chat GPT thing to maybe help me with demand planning or help me with network design? So I think one of the things that I loved about MacGyver was the fact that he could take seemingly, common things that he had at his disposal and put them together in uncommon ways, right, to solve problems. And I think for us as supply chain professionals, we need to think about that the same way. What are the common things that we have laying around at our disposal as a supply chain organization, as a supply chain function? And how can we think about maybe bringing in some new things, maybe reworking the common things that we have so that we can become more agile and more responsive? So to me, MacGyver was a great example of those types of resilience and agility that our supply chains need today.
Mike, what a home run start, I tell you. And a little trivia, folks. MacGyver's first name, I bet not many folks know, was Angus. Angus MacGyver. How about that? And so Richard Dean Anderson, as Mike mentioned, played the original that proud Gen Xers like myself know really well.
Yes.
But Lucas Till was who
Yes.
played the younger version in the 2016 reboot, according to my friends at Wikipedia. But aside from the show, I love your comments there. We all need to embrace our inner MacGyver. And kind of to your last point there, being open-minded and looking for ways we can turn disruption and uncertainty into opportunity. My friend John DeSarbo from ZS was talking about that in a recent blog article. And I think that's the type of thinking we've got to embrace. And then secondly, we were talking pre-show also on a similar note about the A-Team, because there was an element, maybe it was inherent to 1980s shows, but the A-Team, B.A. Baracus, Hannibal Smith, Face, Murdoch, the pilot, they would find themselves in similar situations and be looking around at how they can solve whatever problem so they wouldn't go back to the brig. And man, I loved the A-Team. For a stretch there, we had a Supply Chain Now van, and we were bound and determined to mock it up like the A-Team van.
Yeah.
But anyway, Mike, your last comment before we move to show number 2. Did you watch A-Team?
A-Team was a perfect example. The catchphrase from the A-Team from Hannibal. I love it when a plan comes together.
Yes.
And that is because normally the plan was a off the seat of their pants to off the top of their head type of plan that happened to work out. And sometimes, we need those as supply chains, right? Sometimes we need to trust that our plans will come together and we'll be able to deliver. So A-Team is, again, from that same time frame as the original MacGyver.
Mike, things always come full circle. When I was at Gartner Supply Chain Symposium a few months back, me and Katie Fowler were the A-Team, and how that plan comes together was a big common theme of a conversation we were having there. One of many great ones at Symposium last time. Okay, we could spend an hour talking about MacGyver, folks, but we got a couple more shows we want to get to. Secondly, Mike, luck may be involved. What's your second show?
Yeah, and again, ironically, is another reboot. Is a game show. My wife and I watch a lot of game shows. Sometimes to challenge us intellectually, and sometimes so that we can feel like we're the smartest people in the room compared to the people that are on TV. But one of those game shows we love is the old one called Press Your Luck, and it's now hosted by Elizabeth Banks. It used to be hosted by a guy named Peter Tamarkin. But the catchphrase is, no whammies, no whammies. And I think for what's interesting in Press Your Luck is the whammies. For those of you who haven't seen it, right? It's basically a rotating game board. You hit a button, you either win a prize, hopefully, and hopefully you avoid the whammy, right? That's the synopsis of the show. The challenge in that game, and I think very similarly to the supply chain, is we know there are whammies out there, but we don't necessarily know when they're going to show up, right? In the game show, the whammy doesn't show up until you hit the button. Supply chain, oftentimes the whammies show up at, the least opportune times. And when the whammies show up in Press Your Luck, they basically take all your money and all your prizes. And I think in real life, in the supply chain, when whammies show up, typically bad things happen. So part of, I think, what I like about that show as it relates to the supply chain is we have to know what whammies are out there in our supply chain. Whether it's, looking at our supply base and saying, hey, here's a handful of suppliers that are really important, but they may not be as reliable as we'd like them to be. We've got, weather challenges because of geographically where we have manufacturing and distribution points. We could have, geopolitical and social whammies waiting out there again because of where we're doing business. And similar to what we talked about with MacGyver, it's about how do I win? Because in most instances, if you watch Press Your Luck, it's very rare that a contestant, even the person that wins, goes through an entire game without getting at least one whammy. And it's very unlikely that as supply chains, right, we're going to go through any significant stretches where we haven't hit a whammy of some kind. So recognizing what they are, recognizing what what we can do to mitigate some of those potential whammies if they were to pop up. And in many instances, it's not if, right, Scott? It's when. When they pop up, what are we going to do to mitigate the effects of the whammy? The other thing that I was thinking about as we were talking about this pre-show, the name of the game in and of itself, pressure luck, right, is really, because as you accumulate money and prizes and you have the ability to keep going and pressing your luck, knowing that with one hit, the whammy could show up and take everything away. Part of the supply chain lesson here is knowing kind of when to stop, right? And I think about things like global expansion for companies and companies that are expanding faster than their supply chain can keep up. So being able to recognize, not necessarily when enough is enough. For supply chains, the lesson I think is around making sure that you don't exceed as an organization the capabilities of your supply chain. Because what happens is, as you continue to pressure luck, the likelihood of hitting a whammy becomes more and more likely. And then how you deal with that becomes, how you respond when you get a whammy. So I thought that one is an interesting, from a game show perspective, kind of correlation to supply chain activities.
Mike, I love it. I love that game too. And you know what? To continue the analogy, we don't have as many free spins in the supply chain world. So all the more reason to better define and prepare for the whammies, because we got plenty of whammies. And I don't know if it's the name. I don't know if it's, they had a little whammy character, if you remember that back in the 80s version of the show.
Yes.
I can't remember. But it makes me think of cybersecurity, right? Plenty of whammies. Growing whammies, more complex and more attacks by the day. They grow each and every hour. It seems like. I think of, as you kind of pointed out, supplier relationships. There was a Gartner survey recently where they were surveying chief supply chain officers and how many of them weren't very confident that their ecosystem were prepared for disruption. I think that 6 months was a time frame they used. And it was maybe higher than what most people would have assumed. So I think of investing time in your supply place, getting out and seeing their facilities, sitting down and understanding what good business is for them and some threats to their business. We're only as strong as our weakest supplier. And then finally, I think how we can maybe prepare and mitigate for all the whammies out there is there's an immense opportunity for better and more regular network modeling. Right, all these simulations, leaning into all the technologies out there. We don't do enough of that, I think, as an industry. And I think the pandemic taught us the danger of that. And hopefully more and more leaders are going to remember that lesson learned and put it into good practice. But lots and lots of whammies. Your last thought before we move on to number 3. Yeah,
it's a great point, Scott, around the evolution of the whammy. If you were to watch the show from the 80s, they've done a really good job of keeping kind of the set in the game and all that pretty consistent across the years. But they've definitely evolved the whammies from pretty static characters in the 80s to highly interactive and entertaining little skits now that the whammies do when you hit a whammy. So your point about the evolution of the whammies and things like cybersecurity and those types of things is spot on, right? The whammies, if we continue to use that metaphor, are only going to get more complex.
Yeah,
they're not going to revert to being challenges that maybe we had in the 80s. Those challenges are always going to continue to grow and become more sophisticated as our supply chains become more sophisticated.
Excellent point. Okay. MacGyver, Pressure Luck, the A-Team. We've already touched on a variety of classics. With number 3, this is a little bit more modern of a take, I think. What's number 3 on your radar?
Yeah, so I think everyone that's watched any of our episodes together knows my interest in military history and military stuff in general. My wife and I watch SEAL Team, which is CBS, and then has moved to Paramount Plus. The dynamic, what what I like about show is at least from what I've read, fairly realistic portrayal of what it's like to be a Navy SEAL, the operations they go on, and so on. What I like about that as it relates to our conversation is, each of the members of a SEAL team have, specific responsibilities, right? Specialization. That's their core training, but they're also highly cross-functional, right? So they have, so I may be, the primary communications guy, but I also could be a medic if I had to, right? So I think as it relates to the supply chain, right, we need specialists for sure, but we also need the ability, or have to have the ability, for this cross-functional awareness of other things that are going on in the organization. And I think my message is really, for this particular show, Scott, is probably geared for non-supply chain people to really understand what your supply chain does and what it does for you and how you can use it effectively. If you think about how the military deploys special operations people in general, right? They have a specific function that they're really good at. Whether it's, the Army Rangers, Green Berets, Delta, SEALs, they all have very specialized skills and are best deployed in very special situations. And I think it's leadership's responsibility to understand, not every problem is a nail, right? And not every problem needs a hammer. And I think we need to kind of think about that through the lens of the supply chain by understanding, what does our supply chain do really, really well, and how do we take advantage of that? So if I have a low cost supply chain, how do I take advantage of that? If I have a supply chain that is built to be fast, how do I take advantage of that? How do I play to the success of the things my supply chain does really, really well? And the last thing I'll say is, in the last couple of seasons, the leader of the SEAL team has gone through the character has gone through a couple of serious head injuries. And the team is struggling with, his ability to lead. Can he lead? Can he make good decisions? And the point I take from that is, we also have to be really honest with ourselves around our supply chain capabilities. And when we don't do things as well as we would like, either in a one-off situation, or if a situation like the pandemic highlights deficiencies in our supply chain, we have to own up to that, right? We have to say, hey, during the pandemic, our supply chain wasn't as fast as it needed to be. Let's figure out how we get a faster supply chain. Or during the pandemic, our supply chain compared to our competitors was a little bit more expensive than our competitors. We need to own that. How do we take costs out of our supply chain? So understanding, the strengths of your supply chain, putting it in most often in situations to succeed, but also being honest around where we need to get better. Those are, to me, are two of the big takeaways from SEAL Team.
Oh, Mike, I loved that. Might have been my favorite response out of the three shows, as much as I love the previous two shows. Know thy business as thyself. As you're explaining that, it kind of comes to my mind, and kind of an extension of that, not just as a supply chain practitioner, understanding the advantages and disadvantages, the strengths and weaknesses, but in the greater context of the business and the sector and the industry you're in. That's if you can get that, folks, that's going to help you advance through the business and find more success. The other thing you talked about, the SEAL team, and it reminded me of G.I. Joe figures back in the 80s. I collected hundreds of these things. Yep. And my favorite thing, Mike, is G.I. Joe knew what they were doing. I think Hasbro made it. One of the Hasbro. Yeah. A lot of them were specialists, and a lot of them had that little bio card in the back end, as they kind of had a story for each character. And I loved creating mini SEALs teams. I remember back in the day where you had the comms guy, you got the heavy machine gun person, you got all these different folks that come together and represent an incredible fighting force. And I love mixing and matching and doing that. And it's such a great parallel to constructing teams that can win when it comes to talent and global supply chain. I love that. So one other thing about SEAL team, that leadership comment that you made, being really frank and honest with ourselves, that's got to be a critical first step, I think, before we can really carry that same and critical honesty into our teams, our suppliers, and other conversations we got to have. Your last word before I sneak in a bonus TV show.
Yeah, the feedback piece, Scott, is I'm glad you brought that up. We've been going through here at Gartner this idea and trying to embrace this concept called radical candor, which is really how do we give each other constructive, professional feedback with the spirit in the Gartner environment to really think about our writing, right? And how can we put in a process where we can give each other constructive feedback with the goal being we want to put out the best possible piece of research for our clients. And I think it's, when I think about what we've been learning through Radical Candor, it's about both the ability to get it, but also, and in many instances, and I think from the SEAL team side, it's the ability to receive it. I think we all feel really good that we can give feedback. I think if we're all honest, we aren't necessarily as comfortable getting feedback. And that it needs to be a two-way street.
Excellent point. And I completely agree with you. How can we give that radical candor, that radical feedback, frank feedback, and come out stronger than we went into the conversation? That's
Yes.
like $1 billion challenge for many organizations out there. All right. Wonderful stuff. Mike, also Amanda, who's behind the scenes helping us with production, add a little tip here. Going back to MacGyver, and we talked about Lucas Till. Well, come to find out, our sister-in-law, Beth Midkiff, hopefully you're out there doing well, Beth, you and the family. She was Lucas Till's 5th grade teacher. How about that?
Oh, my gosh.
World. Small world.
Wow.
All right. Man, you never know what you're going to find out on one of these episodes. All right. So, Mike, just like SEAL Team, I'm going to bring kind of a more modern classic. And hopefully for some of our friends and listeners out there, they're fans of Breaking Bad. Now, Mike, you have not watched Breaking Bad yet. Is that right?
Yet. Correct.
Okay. Well, I don't want to spoil anything, but there was we were just writing about this. And with that said, one of our weekly newsletters, and they had a great episode that focused on a train heist. So Walter White, Jesse, and the whole gang, well, their illicit drug making operation had grown so much, kind of to your point earlier, that their supply chain operation wasn't keeping up with the business growth. So one of their key raw ingredients is methylene, which helps them critical ingredient to making meth. Well, they steal methylene from a tank car. They stop the train. They had this intriguing operation where it sucks all the methylene, it stores it in underground tanks, and it's really a cool episode. So, on a related note, though, and here's a great image of Walter White from With That Said. How about that? Moving into pumpkin season, Breaking Bad, but doing good. You can learn more, folks, in our recent newsletter, With That Said, which we publish almost every week. But tying it to supply chain, where am I going here? All this Breaking Bad reminiscence on Breaking Bad. Well, according to some data, cargo theft across supply chains everywhere is up to close 50%, according to some estimates, in 2024 over last year's numbers. So goodness gracious, folks, we got our work cut out for us to protect our freight across the ecosystem. Mike, have you been seeing some stories, unique and common, of cargo theft out there?
Yeah, we have. I mean, we're seeing an uptick in calls into our logistics teams around that type of activity. We don't have, at least I don't think yet, a lot of research on that. I think we're probably going to have to. I mean, I think, similarly to our discussion around like the evolution of the whammies and the evolution of supply chain problems, I think, you had mentioned earlier cybersecurity. I think some of the physical security around how we transport goods, I think is going to need to be something we think more about. My sense is, and I think we talked about this before we kicked off the show formally, right? There's a lot of other noise going on in the world today that I don't think, a train heist or a tractor trailer load getting, hijacked. Unfortunately, that's not going to make the news, given everything else that's going on, at least for the next several months. So the reason I say that, Scott, is just because we don't hear about it doesn't mean it's not happening. And I think for the people affected, it's probably happening more than it has in the past. And we're going to need to figure out how do we keep, those flow of goods, whether it's ships, rail, planes, maybe not quite so much, but certainly tractor trailers. How do we keep the people safe, and how do we keep the cargo safe, and how do we keep the assets safe?
Yeah. Well said. And the data supports your position. Plenty of data out there that shows that rise, not just the rise in cargo theft, kind of similar to cyber, not just the sheer quantity of incidents, but the growing complexity and the more strategic and orchestrated theft of freight across the globe. So, folks, to Mike's point, it's not getting enough attention. It's not hitting the headlines enough. So get with your teams and dive into the critical topic of freight theft. Okay. So, and also another quick plug with that said, check it out. Almost weekly newsletter. We give ourselves a little flexibility there, Mike. And we'll include a link to subscribing in the show notes. All right. So, Mike, I had mentioned Gartner Supply Chain Symposium and a conversation I had with Katie Fowler there earlier in the show. The hits keep on coming. I know there's been some planning events that have risen in popularity with Gartner. What's coming up next when it comes to Gartner and its programming?
Yeah, I think the two recent or the two that are coming up more recently will be the planning summits in London in October, Denver in November. And we just kicked off on Monday our call to papers for our symposiums in May. It's a little bit, not a little bit, it's a tight turnaround for us because we're doing both of our symposiums in May. So early, I think it's the first week in May, we're going to be in Orlando, and just about 3 weeks later, so third week in May, we're going to be back in Barcelona. So sim season is coming. If people have ideas or thoughts around things they'd like to see at symposium, topics they'd like us to cover, shoot me an email, drop something on LinkedIn, because we are now in that process where we're asking all of our experts to think about symposium ideas. And would love to see people at the planning summits and certainly in May at symposium.
Wonderful. Sim season is fast approaching. I like that,
It
Mike.
is.
We're not talking about the video game that was in its heyday earlier. Well, in the 80s and 90s, I guess it was, looking back. Orlando and Barcelona in May, and of course the planning summits that Mike mentioned that are here still in 2024 in London and Denver coming up soon. Good stuff. And Mike, you welcome folks' feedback, topical or otherwise. Yes. How can folks connect with you and the Gartner team?
Yeah, Mike.Griswold at Gartner.com, LinkedIn. Happy to hear from folks, and all suggestions are welcome around how we can make our events better.
I appreciate that, Mike. And folks, here's a little twist on that. Let us know your TV show that you think teaches us great supply chain lessons. I loved your short list, Mike. We could be here for probably hours finding different lessons learned across movies and game shows and TV shows. But great conversation. Folks, we want to hear from you. Let us know your thoughts. Big thanks, as always, to the one and only Mike Griswold, Vice President Analyst with Gartner. Thanks for being here, Mike.
Thanks for having me. Talk to you soon.
You bet, folks. Hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I have. Take one nugget of brilliance that Mike has dropped on us here today and put it into action. Your teams are ready to do business differently and reach new highs. But it's all about deeds, not words. So with all that said, Scott Luton on behalf of the Supply Chain Now team, challenging you, do good, give forward, be the change that's needed. And we'll see you next time right back here at Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for being a part of our Supply Chain Now community. Check out all of our programming at supplychainnow.com and make sure you subscribe to Supply Chain Now anywhere you listen to podcasts. And follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. See you next time on Supply Chain Now.